All right, thanks everyone for being here. I'm happy to see, I think this might be our best attended colloquium yet, which is great to see. Just by way of introduction, I just wanted to say that we here at LPL recognize that there continue to be problems with harassment, discrimination, just workplace climate on the basis of sex, gender, race, ethnicity. These problems persist in planetary science, they persist in the sciences, they persist in academia, and they persist in the culture more broadly. I think, for too long, the response of too many people in academia in particular has been, if we don't talk about it, it's not real. I think in recent years, there's been a real push to talk about this, to address this, to really bring this to the forefront. And that push has really been led by people like our speaker today, Kate Clancy. So Kate is visiting us today from the University of Illinois. She's an associate professor there in the Department of Anthropology. She got her PhD from Yale in anthropology. Her research is focused, I think, broadly on reproductive ecology. Would that be a fair statement? But she's done a lot of work focused on sexual harassment, discrimination, and that includes a number of studies of really direct relevance to those of us here, including a really important paper in JGR on sexual harassment in planetary science, another paper that's also really good to see about work, experiences of people with field work, and then the 2018 National Academies report, which is a really good thing to be aware of. So we're really fortunate to have Kate here, and with that, I'll let you take it away.
I think this just needs to take a second. Okay, I can hear it now. I want to actually start with a land acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge that we gather on the traditional land of the O'odham, Tohono O'odham, and Hohokam, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who've stewarded it throughout the generations. I know that what we're going to be focusing on today is sexual harassment, but sexual harassment is an intersectional thing that affects people across a lot of different lived experiences. And in fact, a lot of, if you are familiar with my JGR paper, you'll know that the focus of that paper was on the experiences of women of color, because women of color actually experience the most frequent and severe forms of sexual harassment, as well as forms of racial gender harassment in the sciences, but also across American workplaces writ large. Just to let you know, I'm going to be, just as a bit of a content warning, I think you can tell from the topic, from the title, what I'm going to be talking about. I typically try to be very careful not to provide really any graphic examples of sexual forms of harassment or assault, but this still could be a triggering or an upsetting thing. So I just want you to think about whether this is something you want to expose yourself to or not, and my feelings do not get hurt if you leave. Because you could be leaving because you have to run to a meeting or teach a class, or because you are having a hard time being here and nobody ever has to know why. So that's totally fine. Where I want to start today, actually, before we even get to sexual harassment, is I want us to think about some of the metaphors. Now, astronomy and planetary science and the physical sciences more broadly don't have a lot of women in them. And there are a lot of stories we tell about why that might be, and a lot of metaphors that we use to describe and understand underrepresentation of women and men of color and white women. We say things like there's a leaky pipeline, or a chilly climate, or a glass ceiling, or what I was told actually when I was an undergrad, a glass ceiling reinforced with concrete. A foggy climate, a sticky floor. All of these, the good thing about these metaphors is they imply a structural problem, right? The bad thing is that they're passive, and so that it makes you feel like the solutions to them are also passive, like a leaky pipeline. Well, there's not enough going into the pipeline, and then there's all these places where women are sort of falling out, right? Which to me makes me feel like there are these fainting couches just available for women to just bonelessly leave the sciences, which I find kind of interesting and hilarious. So the solutions to, say, a leaky pipeline are to turn up the tap, right? To flood the pipeline with more women, or to plug the holes. If we can just stop up those holes, women won't just fall out, right? With the chilly climate, something's inhospitable. So it's either turn up the thermostat or teach women to put on sweaters, right? Those are sort of the metaphor solutions to those types of things. And what I'm hoping we'll arrive at by the end of this talk is maybe a bit of a critical engagement with whether this is really such a passive thing. Women leaving science, is it really a pipeline issue that women just aren't really into it? Is it really an issue that they just sort of passively leave when they just decide it's not for them? Or is there something more active going on that's pushing them out, or that's making them decide that they are going to take their awesomeness and their much cooler tools to some other sandbox? So in order to do that, there's a couple of, I want us to, again, hold these metaphors in our mind, and we're going to take on 3 basic questions. Just what is sexual harassment? So I'm going to give you guys a primer into sort of social science definitions of sexual harassment. Why does it seem to happen so much in the sciences, and what are its broader consequences? I will be drawing in some ways on the National Academy's report that I helped write that came out in June 2018, but this is actually mostly more of a research talk on my research. I'm happy to talk more about the NAS report, though, if people have questions, and the recommendations that I offer at the end are, of course, in a very strong way informed by that report. So sexual harassment, it turns out, is rarely sexual. Social science definitions of sexual harassment have 3 different categories. There's unwanted sexual advances, sexual coercion, and gender harassment. Now, gender harassment is in the put-downs category, and unwanted sexual advances and sexual coercion are in the come-ons category. And it turns out that Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh is a pretty great example of both types of sexual harassment, both come-ons and put-downs. So come-ons, unwanted sexual behavior, unwanted sexual coercion, unwanted sexual advances, that is clearly young Brett Kavanaugh. But if you remember the way that he behaved in his congressional testimony, in the incredibly contemptuous way he, in particular, answered questions of female senators, I often use as the example the way that he treated Senator Klobuchar, then we also see that put-downs or contemptuous behaviors of women and sometimes men intended to demean or belittle, particularly people who are feminine of center, then he also is someone who perpetrates put-downs. Now, come-ons are the ones that we focus on, for the most part, as a society, in our media, in movies, and in the folks who are most frequently reported. So if you look at research that has looked at the types of harassment that tends to be reported in Title IX cases, it tends to be physical acts of harassment, unwanted sexual advances of some sort, and it tends to be vertical. It's like faculty on student or faculty on staff or something like that. So what it looks like then is the landscape of sexual harassment looks like this is what's happening all the time. But in fact, that's not the case. There have been now a number of studies, this is just one, but I could quote 10, that have looked at the types of sexual harassment that actually happens most often in workplaces, and the most common is actually gender harassment, are these contemptuous sexist behaviors that are low level, that most people don't even recognize are legally actionable sexual harassment. And in fact, you can see most sexual harassment includes gender harassment or includes put-downs. So you can see 55, in this sample, where about 75% of the women in the study reported that they were sexually harassed in their workplace. And then this is just all of that 75%. So 55% of the women reporting harassment had gender harassment, and then you can see 31% had gender harassment and unwanted sexual retention. Another 6% had all 3 types. So only 8% had no gender harassment of any kind, was only sort of the sexual, not sexist forms of harassment. What that means is that, again, we actually have a pretty inaccurate picture of what it looks like on the ground every day in American workplaces. In the sciences, we have this same problem. In the sciences, we have examples like Brian Richmond in anthropology at the American Museum of Natural History. This was a come-on and someone who frequently solicited undergraduates, in fact. We've got Jeff Marcy, who you guys might be familiar with. Christian Ott. Oh, wait, you also might be familiar with him. And then Inder Verma, who's one of the more recent cases from the Salk Institute. So again, most of the stories that have actually gone public have been these stories of unwanted sexual advances or sexual coercion. Whereas the one example that I can usually find that's actually in the media, that's the story of a scientist perpetrating more sexist forms of harassment, is David Marchant. He's a BU geologist who works in Antarctica. Marchant, if you don't know the story, it came out about 1.5 years ago now, and a lot of his harassment, so he directed his harassment much more at women than at men. And it was just generally, there was a lot of bullying and abusive behavior. There were elements of it that were sexual, like the part where he tried to force one of his students to have sex with his brother, but a lot of the other harassment was designed to belittle, demean, deride, make the women feel less welcome at the field site. So one of the examples that really breaks my heart is a moment where he was holding a handful of volcanic ash, and I'm talking to an audience who might actually know the typical composition of volcanic ash, right? It contains glass, and brought her closer. Oh, hey, I want to show you something. Brought her face closer and closer until he blew it in her eyes. Another thing he did was pushed her down a mountain multiple times, so she's carrying a heavy pack. He berates her and makes fun of her the entire way up. She gets to the top, he pushes her down, and he yells at her and forces her to do it again. He does this 3 times. He also would throw rocks at the complainant while she would urinate. And you'd be surprised at how many stories I have of abuse while women are trying to urinate or take care of personal business while conducting field work. That's actually an incredibly common form of gender harassment towards women, is to mock them for the fact that they have to like actually remove their pants to pee sometimes. And so that's another way that you can, again, try to remind people of their physical differences and then make them feel excluded or unwelcome in their workplace. So if we think about sexual harassment as an iceberg, what we have at the top are the visible ones, the unwanted sexual advances and sexual coercion. But probably, as many of you know, what lies below the water is actually more treacherous. So we've got sexual jokes or imagery in a talk. Maybe some of you have been at a talk before where someone suddenly shows partway through the talk a pornographic image and just says, oh, just wanted to make sure you were awake. Or uses an image of, say, an attractive female field assistant or grad student and makes sure to point out their beauty for the people in the room, which again excludes the women in the room for being scientists, right? Because then they are objects of desire for the men in the room. We've got sabotage of people's grants, lab work, equipment, or promotion. We've got physical intimidation. This is certainly one that's happened to me a number of times, where someone of a larger size, usually a man, will use their size to physically intimidate and make you feel less than in a professional setting. Asking a mother if she really plans to come back to work. I had a colleague who, this is at the University of Illinois, a grad student who was away on maternity leave, and when she came back, her advisor had made a sticker that had a pregnant outline and a red line through it, and had put it on her office door for when she came back. Another similar example of motherhood harassment, or not similar, but a different example of motherhood harassment was a time that, another one that you might have heard of is when a woman is away on maternity leave, people will start to whisper about whether she's going to come back. That's motherhood harassment. That is implying that her competence or her desire to be in that position is at all compromised by having a child, which is a question you pretty much never ask a guy when he's on paternity leave, right? It's like, oh, I don't know if he's going to come back. You know, I don't know if he's really that serious. I mean, I'm even seeing some smiles when I say that, right? Because it's like, that's a ridiculous statement. You would never hear someone make that about a father. Sexist comments about aptitude. A colleague recently told me at their department, for faculty meetings, there's sort of one conference table and not enough room for everyone to sit at the conference table, so there's a second row of chairs around the back. We've been in those kinds of rooms before, right? The men often show up early and take up all the seats at the table. And so then as the women are filtering in, they all have to sit in the back. But then what also happens is a couple of the men think it's really funny to yell at them as they're coming in, going, women don't belong in science. And they're saying it with a big smile on their face, so it's supposed to be a joke. So if you say anything about that joke, you are of course not able to take a joke, right? So it puts the women as they're walking in this really unfortunate bind of like, do I say, wow, that's really not funny? And then immediately get labeled as, oh, well, now you're not one of the guys, you aren't able to take jokes, you aren't able to take teasing. Or do you laugh, or what do you do in that situation, right? So the other thing that I want to briefly mention about this treacherous part of the iceberg is that the reason it's able to stay there and stay cold and this iceberg stays where it is because of a culture of incivility, and that's what we think of as the ocean. So incivility are rude acts of ambiguous intent, and there's been a lot of research on incivility in the workplace. And incivilities are in fact selective. So even when they seem ambiguous, so for instance, if whenever I went to work, my mug was always missing because someone was always using it, and I always communicated, hey, could you stop using my mug? That's like the only one I bring at work, right? It's kind of an ambiguous thing. It's just like a dick move, basically, right? It's like being kind of rude, but it's not about that. It's not saying, oh, I'm stealing this mug because you're a woman, right? You have no idea why it's happening. Or if someone drops you from a collaboration, oh, hey, we just got this grant funded, and you know how it is. We have to now say that we can do the same thing and slightly less money, so we're going to drop your aim from the project. Hope that's okay. I know a woman who's actually starting to compile data on this because she hears this happening to women, female PIs way more often than male PIs, is that they get dropped from collaborations after getting the funding, right? Because they need the woman on the grant to help get the grant. But then once they get the grant, then the woman gets dropped from the collaboration. So there's things that you can't always tell. Is this because I'm a woman, or is it like, why is this happening? These are ambiguous, but they are still selective. So ample research at this point has shown that women of color, followed by white women, men of color, then white men, experience even general incivilities at greater rates, okay? So if a white man is in a particular workplace context and is like, wow, people here are kind of rude, they don't know the half of it. Because they are still experiencing incivilities, right? They're experiencing that toxic workplace, but not to the same degree as folks with different subjectivities or different lived experiences. So and then the one last point about this is that these acts that lie below the surface, that are allowed to happen, or in fact are increased in risk by incivilities, actually have worse personal and professional consequences than those things up at the top. And I'm going to talk more, we're going to get to that when we talk more about consequences, but I want you to kind of hold in your head the idea that these things that seem like, like just crappy things that happen from time to time at work, and those that seem like really big deals, it turns out that these seemingly crappy things actually have worse personal and professional consequences. These things you can externalize. You can say, wow, that person's a jerk, right? These are a little harder to externalize and say, wait, it's not about, this is definitely not about me, it's about them. It's a little harder, it's a little easier to say, maybe this is about me. So some of the first work that I've done in this area is on field sites, and we asked some very simple questions. This was not a prevalence sample by any means. We just wanted to assess the extent to which we could observe this in a large sample. And so in a sample of over 600 field scientists, we just asked, what frequency have you observed gender harassment, right? Put downs in a field site context, and it was about 80% of women and 60% of men observing inappropriate behaviors. So these are just what they observed, not what they directly experienced. Once we asked what they directly experienced, those numbers went down a little bit, but not by much. It was around 70 to 75% of women, and I think around 40% of men directly experienced gender harassment in a workplace context. You'll notice there is a statistically significant difference between women and men. There's a quantitative difference here in terms of the degree to which women and men are sexually harassed, which matches the 30 years of sexual harassment literature we have. But there also, in the field sciences, were some interesting qualitative differences to our mind. And one of them was that one of the questions we asked was, who was your perpetrator in terms of their relationship to you in the field site. So are they your peer? Are they superior to you? Are they inferior to you in sort of the science hierarchy that you're operating in? Or are they a local? And part of the reason we included this question is that as we were starting as the SAFE team, the Survey of Academic Field Experiences team, was talking about how to develop this survey, one of the things that many people told us is, oh, what you're going to find is all the sexual harassment is those locals. It's the locals who are doing it all, and it's because you're in this different cultural context and they're behaving inappropriately to Americans, but it's not really inappropriate to them. This seemed really racist because scientists are mostly white, and in a lot of this field research, it's white people going to where brown people live and then presuming to know what they're, to go in and do all the discovering of these things that those people already know about because they live there. But we thought maybe we should test this question so that we can gently explain that was a racist thing to say. And what we did in fact find is that for the vast majority of perpetration occurred within the hierarchy of the field site. And for women, perpetrators were more often superior to them in the hierarchy. And for men, the perpetrators were more often peers. That certainly does mean sometimes local community members were responsible, but you can see it's a minority of cases. Now, what that means is that in the field sciences, women experience not only a higher frequency, most likely, of sexual harassment, but they also experience more extreme forms of sexual harassment because vertical harassment is much worse for professional outcomes. It increases job turnover intentions. It also makes it hard to have anyone to talk to if it happens, right? Who do you report to if it's your boss who's sexually harassing you and you're in a remote field site very far away from your campus? So another thing we found then, of course, if vertical harassment is sort of a greater concern in these remote field sciences, and you can imagine that those of you who do any of your work at national labs, those of you who do any of your work at remote observatories, you might have similar sort of scientific context to folks who do work in the field sciences. But because vertical harassment was such a concern, it also turns out that trainees, especially female trainees, are the most vulnerable in the field sciences. They're the ones who reported the highest rates of both sexual harassment and sexual assault. Now, as you probably, as you know from the introduction, I also have a paper with Christina Ritchie and Erica Rogers and Katie Lee on the experiences of women of color in astronomy and planetary science. Now, what we found there was almost identical numbers in a sample of over 400 individuals, where, as you can see, it's somewhere around 80% of women and somewhere around 60% of men reporting that they observed sexist remarks in a workplace context. And so again, what you find across many, many, many different studies over 30 years of studying this, starting with Louise Fitzgerald back in the early 90s, is that this is about the same percentage you find in most male-dominated spaces. So most spaces that have more men than women, these are the percentages you tend to get. And like I said, in astronomy, we were really curious about exploring the experiences of women of color. And part of the reason for that is that one of the things I noticed when the SAFE study was covered is that all of the stock photos and the artwork that was done by like the New York Times and WAPO and USA Today were all white women. And they were all, also, this was the field sciences, right? But the pictures were women in a lab coat in front of a microscope. And then I was like, I don't even use a microscope, so I don't remember what it's called. In front of a microscope, and then like the sad body language, right? The poor put upon white girl who everyone gets to feel bad about, and then there's like some man hand on her shoulder, right? That was like all of the images were, again, the artwork as well as the stock photos. It was all sad girl in front of microscope, sad white girl in front of microscope, hand on her shoulder. And I was just really struck by that because my data did not support that it's like white ladies are the premier most vulnerable group. But we just hadn't shown that data because we had been really concerned in our field sciences data about being too identifying. And so we had intentionally not added in a racial category as another area of analysis. But we just decided, well, screw it. What we'll do is it's not ideal, but we'll take, as a way to keep from being identifying, we'll have white as one racial category and then everyone who doesn't identify as white in the other racial category, just to keep from any of those racial categories being identifying, and we'll do the comparison that way. And that was how we sort of decided to keep it, protect participants, but still try to share some of these data. And what we found is basically every single place where there was a significant difference, women of color experienced the worst of everything and the most of everything. So they experienced the most racist remarks, the most sexist remarks, the most comments that they weren't masculine or feminine enough, not only from their peers, but from their supervisors. And the thing is not a ton of things always pulled out, because I gotta say, the numbers for harassment were really high for everybody in this sample. Like every single category, people were reporting incredibly high rates. And so even though women of color and white women are experiencing the most, I also just want to notice and acknowledge that the numbers were actually very high for everybody. And that's maybe something we're thinking about, given what I was saying before about incivilities. And about just like if you have an overall toxic climate, that can potentially pave the way for gender racial harassment to be a greater risk. Now, one of the things that really, that gave me pause when we were first doing these analyses for this particular data set is we had two questions that we asked that were different in this sample than the other one. We asked, have you ever been made to feel unsafe in your workplace? And then we asked, have you ever skipped any professional events because you felt unsafe? And my grad student, Katie Lee, was doing all the analyses, and the way she'd do it is she'd finish up what she was doing, put it into a PDF for me so that I could so it was kind of pretty and I could see it, and she'd drop it into Slack, and then she'd come downstairs and she'd sit down next to me and we'd pull it up and look at it together. So one day, when she was doing the analyses for those questions, she dragged it into Slack, I saw it come up, I open it, anticipating her showing up in a minute, and I start reading it through, and I burst into tears. Because there's this way where I think, I don't know how often we really sit with and actually take the perspective of the other folks in our workplaces who don't hold the same identities that we hold and don't have the same privileges we hold. I am a woman. I can talk a lot about the ways in which my gender has been, my gender is not a problem, but my gender is clearly a problem to some people, right? But I think as a white person, I don't know that I get confronted often enough with the lived experience of being a person of color, in particular a woman of color in American workplaces, and in particular male-dominated American workplaces like the sciences. I just want to remind you that for these data, we asked them just about the last 5 years of their lives, not like have you ever been made to feel unsafe ever, but just in the last 5 years, just in your current job, have you ever been made to feel unsafe? And 40% of the women of color of our sample said that they felt unsafe at some point. And I just want you to sit with that for a minute and think about the women of color that you know. That's almost half. It means likely almost half of the women of color that you know and interact with on a daily basis in your workplace context do not feel safe here. This obviously is a sample. This is a broader sample of astronomy and planetary science. I'm not trying to make some extension to just this department. But I still think it's worth thinking through what this might mean, right? When you become a scientist, I've really loved some of the meetings I've had today because, like Jeff said, I'm a biological anthropologist. We study human evolution, which means we think on scales of millions of years. You guys think on scales of billions of years. You think about you think about existence, right? I've talked to people who are studying volcanoes on Venus, right? Who are thinking about atmospheres on exoplanets. Like some, moon rocks, right? I'm trying to remember all the great things I learned today from some really amazing students. You guys are studying really extraordinary things, and you're here because it's a calling. You're here because this is something that you really love, and you show up every day not to punch a clock and just get your benefits and your pension, right? You're here because even though chances might not be great that you're going to get the job of your dreams, you're here because you really, really, really love this stuff. So when someone takes that away, and takes that away from 40% of an identity group, 27% of white women, by the way, so over a quarter of them as well, I want you to think about the ways in which your science is impoverished, the way in which your department is fundamentally diminished when you create a climate that does that, when we create a climate. Again, I'm not trying to say this to you specifically. And just please sit with that. Because what we also found is a significant number of white women and women of color also feel unsafe, also skip work events because they feel unsafe. Those who reported being sexually harassed were more likely to report skipping work events, so that was also a statistically significant relationship that we found. And when you skip a work event, right, what are you missing out on? If you skip a work event, the people who are there are going, well, what's Kate doing? Why didn't Kate show up today, right? So then there's the question of, is she really into this? Does she care enough about the work because she didn't bother to show up? So then that potentially diminishes your standing in a department. You also miss out on an actual opportunity to potentially learn something really cool or develop a great network or develop a collaboration, right? So there are real professional consequences to missing things. Despite the fact that I would also argue that missing things are sometimes incredibly smart self-care for people who are enduring, entire days of microaggressions from people and just are like, you know what, I'm done with you guys. I got to go home and sit with my cat because you people are too much, right? So it's a smart healing move, but it has professional consequences. I also want to briefly share, this is a paper that's in prep, but I think we're meeting next week to kind of finalize the submission, and we're going to be submitting in a few weeks, is that one of the other groups that we are looking at, so to pivot away from talking just about experiences of women of color versus white women, because we've also been talking a lot in this research about LGBTQ folk and the ways in which gender minorities and LGBT folk are also further marginalized in a lot of science contexts. So in our astronomy and planetary science sample, we have done some analyses, and I just want to briefly share those as well, even though this is obviously, we haven't submitted this paper yet. What the figure I'm going to show you first is sexual harassment comparison between cis straight women and LGBTQ pan women and gender minorities, because we decided just to compare among gender and women minorities in order to really try to parse out what the sexuality, gender identity piece was doing. And we did find that LGBTQ pan women and gender minorities experience greater rates of sexual harassment than cis straight women. And again, the rates are kind of high for everybody, so some of these differences are not huge. But one of the ones that was huge was actually when we asked about physical harassment. And physical harassment due to sex is hugely different between these two groups. And so 9% of the cis straight women in our sample report being physically harassed, so being assaulted while at work. So that's a huge number, right? Almost 10%, almost 1 in 10 of the women in this sample are physically assaulted at work. 21% of the LGBTQ sample, and I know that's a small number in terms of absolute terms, but the relative number is pretty appalling, right? 21% of our sample of LGBTQ women and gender minorities report physical assault while at work. The last place I want to end is one more piece that we have that's a revision. This is with a different set of collaborators, but I want to also put a little thought into the classroom setting and the ways in which we're training the next generation. So this is a physics context, but obviously many of you are trained physicists or come from physics and then joined planetary science by way of some other physical science, so these folks are still pretty relevant to you. This sample is just from 2 years ago, and we asked them just in the last 2 years, while in college, and we use the SEQ, the Sexual Experiences Questionnaire, so it's able to ask questions of both sexual and sexist forms of harassment. And you can see, again, 75% of the women of this sample, and these are undergrads, so like 18 to 22-year-olds in our classrooms and study groups and sections and labs, report sexual harassment. And most of it was, in fact, gender harassment. So again, matching the literature on historically male or male-dominated spaces, we're seeing about 3/4 of women reporting sexual harassment. We don't actually know who the perpetrators are necessarily for this sample, whether they tend to be peers or they tend to be vertical, but the field sciences data is a bit of an anomaly, where the vertical effects were very strong. Across most workplaces, the peer effects are stronger. But what that means is that male undergraduate physicists seem to think it's okay to harass female undergraduate physicists if this matches sort of what we tend to expect of the literature. Either way, it's a pretty large number. So what are the consequences of these types of harassment? So like I said, we've got sort of the type of harassment, a come on or a put down, and the severity of personal and professional outcomes. And most people think intuitively that the more severe ones, and therefore the more severe personal and professional outcomes, come from come-ons, come from, unwanted sexual advances and sexual assault. However, the things that complicate the picture or moderating factors are both perpetrator power and the frequency of it. So if you have a more vertical harassment, you've got more severe outcomes, or if it's something that happens a lot, which is the case with gender harassment, you have worse outcomes. Another one is variety. So gender harassment is one that it's like sometimes you get 5 different things happen to you in one day. You're not necessarily keeping track, you're just really tired at the end of the day. But because there's such a wide variety of ways in which gender harassment can manifest, sometimes when there's a wide variety, that also increases the severity of the personal and professional outcomes. There have been a number of meta-analyses now that have shown this pretty strongly. One of the ones this is not a meta-analysis. What I wanted to show with this one is this created an aggregate value for job-related outcomes. There's also an almost identical graph for personal outcomes, but just because they're identical, I didn't bother showing both. And this asked about experiences of incivility, gender harassment, and sexualized harassment. And you can see with increasing worse outcomes, where do you see the biggest drop? With these seemingly minor things that seem general, but have been shown repeatedly to actually be selective, right? That even when they don't seem to be, it's not, I'm saying this to you because you're a woman, or, hey, I'm doing this jerk thing to you right now because you're black, right? They aren't necessarily adding something to it that makes it obvious why it's happening. So that's why it gets categorized as incivility. You don't know why it's happening to you. But we know because of the frequency, the fact that they happen in different frequencies across different groups of people, that they are still quite targeted. Again, the biggest drop in outcomes comes from these general things, and then a next pretty big one for gender harassment, and then a smaller one when you add in sexualized harassment. So again, this shows that these things that we take for granted as just, look, suck it up, buttercup, this is just what it means to do science, just put up with it. These are actually the things that are making life worse for people. I also want to give a couple of examples from some of our qualitative work. So one of the things that we found is that women who are harassed, women in particular who are harassed, they can stall out of their careers, they can quit, they can take lateral moves, and so in all sorts of different ways try to avoid or get around their harassers. And of course, none of that ever really works. So here's one example. So this person was harassed while in the field, and she says, and it did prevent me from even thinking about my sites for about a year after returning from the field because of the proximity of the incident to my field site. Anytime I tried to think about my project, it put me back in that field and back in that incident. So harassment has really long consequences and in fact produces PTS symptoms for a lot of people because when they have that experience and it's in a workplace context, imagine that you're collecting data and someone is harassing you. And then you have to go analyze that data. That means every time you're pulling up that data, you're reminded of that incident, if it's a really powerful or awful incident or someone who had a lot of power over you, right? So it's not just personal in the sense that it's producing these PTS symptoms, it's professional, in that then it makes it hard for you to keep doing that work. This was something that came up again and again and again in the interviews I conducted both among field scientists and among astronomers in planetary sciences, and more recently with women of color science faculty across all of the sciences. Harassed women also experience retaliation. So this story is one where a woman had a lot of sexual advances against her, towards her by her field site director, and so she kept rebuffing him, but then at the end of the field season, she tried to find a new field site in a similar location so that she could still do similar work, but not have to deal with this guy ever again. So she was just trying to figure out how can I go around him. But he got wind of it, that she was not coming back to his field site and was going to a different one. The result of this was that he is now professionally blackballing me, for lack of a better word. I went to this country to do my dissertation work, and he had contacted people to refuse me access to material that I had excavated, and was kind of doing things to, I don't know, to be an inconvenience to me because I slighted him or burned his advances or whatever. One last example I want to give, and then I think I'm going to skip one section so that I have time to move on to solutions, is one of the things that I find most heartbreaking about these data sometimes are the ways in which people who are more likely to be targeted or have been targeted and are trying to avoid being targeted again change their behaviors. Because as I'm sure you guys know, right? So like sexual victimization happens to all people, but it doesn't just happen to, say, reproductive aged people. It happens to children. It happens to the elderly. It happens to able-bodied and not able-bodied people. Right? It happens to lots of different types of people, and you can change what you're wearing, you can change where you walk at night, and that doesn't necessarily change your risk. But a lot of folks will constantly contort themselves to try to avoid it in ways that deny who they really are as people. So this is an archaeologist, and she said, when I'm in the field, I act in a more stereotypically masculine way to gain respect among the men. But it's funny because I feel like I'm very feminine. I like to get dressed up, I like to do all that stuff, but at the same time, I'm very tomboyish. And I guess that's why I'm an archaeologist, is I like being in the dirt, I like being in the sun, I love discovery, I love all those things. And most of the time, I don't feel like, oh, I'm a woman in the field. I may be able to drink and swear with the rest of them, but in the end, I still have a certain vulnerability that I have to take into account. Imagine, for those of you who have privileged identities where you've never, ever, ever had to think about those things before, imagine what it might do to your science if that was a constant calculus that you were doing all the time of like, oh, I can't be left alone with this person. Oh, this person always says really racist stuff to me. Oh, I have to deal with this. Oh, I can't, like if that was part of your general workplace calculus, it really makes your work hard to do. So why does this actually happen? This is the part I'm going to do super fast because I want to actually talk a bit about solutions as a way of just sort of leaving you guys room for questions you can ask in the Q&A. There's this term that's emerged in the last year in the workplace literature called the masculinity contest. And a masculinity contest is when workplace cultures focus not on mission, but on masculinity. So on the types of behaviors that have been attributed to maleness and valued by men. And if people in a workplace context are majority male or that work was originally or historically done by men, then a lot of times, regardless of the current makeup of that group, they're going to have a lot of masculine ideals around what it means to be a good worker, about what it means to do good work, about what it means to have success, and then the incentive structures are all going to be set up to support those types of things, right? So the classic antecedents of sexual harassment are male domination and organizational tolerance of harassment. So I've already kind of talked about male domination, But organizational tolerance is when any one of the three conditions, the following conditions are met, where you don't take complaints seriously, you don't protect complainants from retaliation, or you don't sanction perpetrators. Any one of them is true, and you have what's called an organizationally tolerant of harassment workplace. So these are things that have been shown over many, many decades to be really important to understanding sexual harassment. But in the sciences, I want to offer a couple of additional pieces. I think that we have a lot of white Western ideals of masculinity embedded in the way that we practice and produce science, because the way that we currently practice science is Western, right? It comes from these elite institutions in Europe, and we still kind of do things the same way, and we still have the same apprenticeship models and the same incentives for success. The sciences are often kind of resistant to critique, and we often feel the importance of science renders its practice above reproach. It's so important that we do this work that who cares how we treat each other, right? I've heard that a lot. And so I just want to offer, again, for time's sake, I'm not going to go into too much more about this, but I just want to offer that maybe that's not a productive way to run a workplace. That's the short version. You can ask me more about it later. There are, and the one other thing I want to say is if we have these incentive structures that incentivize certain types of behaviors, or like getting X number of papers, or showing yourself, getting X amount of grant money or whatever, and that this is how we show success, then we also have to take into account the fact that we have not all started at the same difficulty setting of the video game of life. So I know I was talking to one group earlier about the fact that I'm a sci-fi fan, and I was talking about the fact that I've finally started reading Kim Stanley Robinson. Well, I've been reading John Scalzi for a really long time. And if you are familiar with him and his series Old Man's War, he's a really fun writer. But he has this article he wrote on his blog, whatever, in 2012 called Straight White Male, the Lowest Difficulty Setting There Is. And I would encourage you to read it, because I think it's a really great way of thinking about the ways in which privilege is like it's like playing the video game on the easy setting. So then when you get the best armor and you have the easiest time beating the foe and you get the princess at the end, and then anyone playing on the medium or hard difficulty setting has a slightly harder time, but the end reward is identical, there's maybe a problem there with how we are creating rewards. Okay, so one other last point. One of the other things that further complicates and worsens this entire scenario are the ways in which underrepresented and underserved folks, by definition, do not have people around them who look like them or have similar lived experiences to check their experiences. So this is from some focus group work that we have in revision right now with women of color science faculty. And one of the things we were really struck by is that, all of the women we spoke to had really profound, huge, not great experiences. They had lots of incivilities, lots of racial harassment, lots of sexual harassment to talk about, but depending on if they had other women of color to talk to or not, the result it had on their mental health and their careers was profoundly different. So the women who had social support, they were able to develop a meta-awareness about what they had. Or they also said, actually, that having papers to read on it was also helpful to them. Anytime they could externalize and have a shared experience and check it with other people with similar lived experiences meant that they were able to recognize, this is not about me. I know why this is. This is because of broader structures of racism and sexism. Women who were in departments where they were the only, where they didn't have other people to check their experiences with, they were basically gaslighting themselves. In our sessions, they were saying things like, I don't know, maybe it's just me. Maybe it's okay that this guy actually took my lab and I came to work the next day and it was closed. Maybe it's just me. Wow, that doesn't seem like a thing that's just you. That literally they changed the key of your lab and took it away one day. I don't know. Just some of these stories were appalling, and yet the way that they gaslit themselves was just, maybe it's me, maybe I'm really not that good, maybe I did come from a second-tier school, well, maybe my Harvard degree isn't really that good of a degree because it was in this department, not this department, and so maybe they just don't value it as much. That's the kind of storytelling they were telling because they didn't have anyone to check their thinking with, right? So when we create conditions of predominantly white institutions that serve predominantly white experiences, and we don't do enough work to recruit and retain women and men of color, this is what we end up doing to the people of color in our midst. It is not enough to bring them in and to throw them to the wolves, right? We have to bring them in to a setting that is actually safe for them and allows them to be brave and interesting and cool with their research. So to that end, I would like to offer a different metaphor for the issues of underrepresentation in the sciences, and that's the gauntlet. The gauntlet, if you don't remember, if you don't know, is when there are two rows of people and you have to run between them and they hit you over the head with sticks. That is what a gauntlet is. And you know what? A woman of color in science, to a lesser extent a white woman in science, this is what it feels like every day. To walk down that hall, to have to handle different types of snide remarks, different little slights, different little moments of being excluded, and having to spend all of this time trying to figure out, is it because I really am less good? Is it because I really don't belong? Or is it because these folks are being jerks, right? Having to do that work all day long and suffering actual professional consequences for it. So a couple of course corrections. The first two are from the NAS report, and in some ways the first one I hope we've covered, which is that we need to better understand gender harassment and have that be the point of intervention, not unwanted sexual advances and sexual coercion. Because when we stop gender harassment, we stop 92% of what's happening. When we stop unwanted sexual advances, we only deal with a fraction of it. We need to move beyond legal compliance and towards community engagement. When you just report things to Title IX and you just say, look, I did my job, I reported it to Title IX, guess what? Most of the time, Title IX doesn't have a positive finding, even if they want to, even when they're good investigators who really care. The legal standard is incredible. Like, universities are encouraged to hold a very high legal standard. And so that means that you can have a huge range of really awful, disgusting behaviors be not legally actionable by the university. So that means that what we're saying is it's only if they're so disgusting that like a whole bunch of Title IX coordinators all agree that the general counsel won't get mad at them if they actually find this one person finally guilty. That's the standard that the Title IX office has to meet, right? And that means that we allow everything else in our midst if that's the only way that we ever adjudicate what's happening in our personal spaces. That means we have to start fixing whole barrels, not bad apples. It's not that there's a couple of people you can just pluck out and fix the problem. The problem is the broader structure. And so to that end, the other thing I'd add is that we need to think about ways in which we can better honor the present and look around this room and say, okay, this is actually a pretty cool crew. People who decided to show up to this talk, who are committed to change in this area, and who want to see this department be like the best it can be. And what would it look like to honor the people in this room? That's the question you have to ask, not whatever the white men were who founded this department 50 years ago or something like that. You know what I mean? Not whatever the statues are that populate this campus, but the people who are here today. And then finally, we also need to include to create excellence. And I think that's the reverse of what a lot of us assume, is a lot of us think that exclusion is how you get to excellence. I'm trying to think for time whether I go into this one or not. I will. I want to read one. Do any of you know who Zoe Quinn is? Some of you, yeah, right, good. We got some cool nerds in the room then. That makes me happy. So Zoe Quinn experienced horrible online harassment and doxing by her ex-boyfriend a number of years ago. It turned her into an online activist to try to address online harassment. And one of the things that she learned over time is the absolute inadequacy of legal solutions and the necessity of community responses. And what that means is backing away from thinking about everybody as good guys and bad guys. Instead, thinking of all of us as people who are capable of causing harm and capable of being harmed. And in that context, what does that mean about how we address these things differently, right? Gender harassment is not me coming up to and smacking someone in the face. It's not me coming up to someone and saying, you are less worthy as a human being. These are not like big, and this is not me coming on to somebody and saying, if you don't have sex with me tonight, you're failing my class, right? Gender harassment is smaller. Sometimes it's unintentional, sometimes it is clueless. A lot of gender harassment can be fixable if we decide we have a community response to addressing it. So she says, therein lies the most common trap we fall into when trying to make the internet a safer place, because then she's talking about online harassment, framing it as a war of good people versus bad people, instead of looking at acceptable and unacceptable ways to treat each other. Good people get off the hook for doing bad things, while bad people aren't considered worth understanding or empathizing with, and aren't encouraged to progress, evolve, and do better. The question isn't, what the hell is wrong with those people? It's, what the hell is wrong with us? No, I did not put a slide about this. So then, again, just briefly in terms of thinking about representation, This is Quinn, the quintessential engineer. It just happens to be one good example from my university. I could name you 20 bad examples from my university, so I'm not trying to say Illinois is so much better than Arizona. But Illinois, we do have this one female statue that just came out a couple years ago, our female identified statue, Quinn, the quintessential engineer, and I can't tell you what it did. We have a project that looks at the experiences of women of color undergrads in engineering that just happened to be, we just happened to be recruiting around the time this statue was released. So we have all of these quotes and interviews of women who are like, I took a selfie with Quinn the engineer, it was so cool. To finally have some representation, some pictures that looked like them, that like made them feel like they had role models and like a place in engineering was huge. And so it's a small thing. It's one of 20 or 100 things Illinois should be doing, but it is one thing, right? Thinking about representation rather than old versions of perhaps what astronomy should be looking like. What would the new version of astronomy look like, and how can that be represented in the images that just flood this area, right? I want to end on one last thought, and it's about the scientist. I'm going to get emotional, and I do this because I do this. I was telling somebody earlier, 50-50, I cry, everyone, like 50-50 that I cry at my own talks. It's emotional material. The scientist that I probably take most personally, most recently, is to start and end with the Kavanaugh case. Some of you may have been disclosed to, right, over the last years of friends and colleagues who've experienced sexual harassment. And you may have asked, you might be cringing as you're thinking of it, well, why didn't you ever do anything about it? Why didn't you ever report? Well, there is this Title IX thing here. Why don't you just report it to Title IX? And I hope that after what happened with the Kavanaugh case and Christine Blasey Ford, that you never, ever ask that of a friend or colleague again. Because frankly, it is not safe to report. I want you to think about what this woman went through, what she was probably thinking in this moment, right? What she was thinking in this moment is, I know that this is going to destroy me. I know that this isn't going to do anything. And she said as much in her opening statement. She said, I'm stepping in front of a moving train. She did it anyway, this act of courage for all of us, right? She did it to remind us that there are real victims behind some of these entitled men. And there are real women behind these structures that are causing harm. But it wasn't for her. It wasn't to fix her situation. So what I want to do is insert a new picture of Blasey Ford, because you might not know this, because you're not social scientists, but she is a badass researcher and statistician. Did you know that Dr. Christine Blasey Ford studies trauma? Did you know that she gives voice to the voiceless? Did you know that she, like I said, is such an amazing statistician that her book is used in research methods classes in the social sciences all over the country? This is the Dr. Blasey Ford that we should be reminded of and left with. And this is what happens when victims put themselves forward, is that we see that other image and we don't remember that actually the whole reason that they were reporting, the whole reason they were trying to do anything about this in the first place was to get back to doing all of this. Thank you.